a story. A story of CPUs. It's useful, in fact, very useful um, for investing in CPU companies. Today we'll just talk about Intel and AMD. All right, so AMD's been on a tear for the past couple of years. I actually made quite a bit of money on this one. I got in at around early 2016 and sold this summer. Unfortunately, I did not get the $16 to $30 part, but I did get from 2.5 all the way to $16. So that wasn't bad. Okay, so before I say anything about why I bought it then and all that stuff, we'll just start with my history with these two companies. So personally, I always had a bit of a fascination with computer hardware, even when I was like piss poor and in primary school. So my daydreams involved thinking about how much hardware what hardware I can put together with whatever fantasy budget that I had. I used to be able to recount all the CPU's clock frequencies. They're back then that was like the I think it's called the system bus. How much L2 they have, L2 cache they have, and their relative performance in terms of different use cases, like gaming versus, well, mostly gaming, because that's what I was dreaming about. But then that was about 1993, 94, 95 actually. 95 is when I started, like the era of Pentium 2. That's when I started paying attention to everything. So Pentium 2 uses the same microarchitecture as Pentium, really. So actually, no, not Pentium, but Pentium Pro. So Pentium Pro is actually much better than Pentium itself. And a microarchitecture, okay, so some names. An architecture is really just the instruction set. For example, you have the x86 architecture, or you have the ARM architecture, and there are revisions to the architecture. For example, the x86 later it was 32-bit, and then it got to 64-bit is by an extension from AMD, in fact. And so architectures do evolve and sometimes introduce more instructions. An instruction is just an operation. So if you send an instruction to the CPU, it does a particular thing. And within the same architecture, the way you arrange your hardware is the way you design and build your hardware is referred to as microarchitecture. So things that can differ in a microarchitecture could be the way you implemented branch prediction, the way you implemented pipelining, your how you decode things, and how many instructions you have in flight, and all that crazy shit. We can talk about that later, but so that's the thing. So when you refer to a particular generation of CPU, so for the people that are in the know, you had AMD recently had Zen, which is the microarchitecture, but the CPU is marketed as Ryzen. Well, Intel, I think currently it's Coffee Lake, and when it's sold, Coffee Lake is microarchitecture, but the product it's Intel Core i3 or Pentium or i7 or i9 or even Xeon. So when we look at a CPU, its performance is determined really just by two things: its microarchitecture and its frequency. Those are the only two determinants. The microarchitecture tells you how many instructions can be run in a single clock cycle. So what is a clock cycle? So you hear a lot of times you say, oh, this CPU is 4 gigahertz. What does that mean? That means it runs 4 billion clock cycles every second. Now, for each clock cycle, you can run a particular number of instructions, but in the era of just scalar CPUs, it will be under 1. For the ideal situation of a scalar CPU, it would be 1, but usually things are not ideal, so you get under 1. And for a superscalar CPU, nowadays almost all the CPUs that we use are superscalar, and it would be typically above 1, potentially approaching 2 and even more than that. Right? So IPC times your frequency is your performance, and IPC is determined by microarchitecture. So keep those in mind. All right, so in the era of Pentium 2, the corresponding AMD CPU was K6-2. It's basically K6 with an instruction set extension called 3D Now. So these instruction set extensions are basically specialized instructions to, usually they are SIMD. SIMD is short for single instruction multiple data. So these are basically things that you specify, okay, do this operation on a bunch of data, do the same thing on a bunch of data. Right? So it's much faster than saying, okay, do the instruction on this data, do the instruction on this data, and keep saying that to the CPU. Essentially send one instruction, and then you perform the same operation on all a certain number of data items, typically 8 or 16 or even 32, depending on the size of your register and all that stuff. Now, K6-2 was almost as good as Pentium 2, although it wasn't better. Right? So remember that. And then Intel introduced Pentium 3. And Pentium 3 actually went through 3 iterations. The first one started with a K something, and that one essentially is just Pentium 2 with SSE. SSE is Intel's extension. It's called streaming something. Anyway, what you need to know is it's another one of those instruction set extensions that deals with single instruction multiple data. And that was met with AMD's K7 Athlon. And Athlon was the first time in AMD's history where it was actually arguably better than Intel's design. So I remember my first CPU for my first PC, my own PC. It was a Thunderbird, which was a one of the generations in Athlon, the K7 microarchitecture. So what are the things that it's competing against? First of all, it's competing against. It started off competing against Pentium 3, the first generation, essentially K something, I don't remember the name, K whatever. And then it competed with Coppermine. Coppermine was a 180 nanometer node, and Athlon started off with the same 250 and went into 180. So as the process technology gets smaller, you can fit more transistors on the chip and also reduce power consumption. And by doing that, your power budget per transistor goes up, and then your transistor count goes up. So you basically can do more things with the CPU, right? So the reason past designs on CPUs wasn't advanced as now new designs now. The main reason is that they were using an older technology, so they couldn't really do that many more things, because to do anything new, you will need more transistors, and then you will run into the size of the chip becomes a problem, and then power becomes a problem. And the size of the chip becomes a problem in two ways. One, it becomes just because the size gets bigger, the design becomes more difficult. The reason is electrical signals only travel so fast, right? When you are running at gigahertz, imagine you're running 1 gigahertz. You have 1/1000th of 1 second to get to the destination of your receiver. Otherwise, you would have missed the clock boundary. Now, yeah, electricity goes really fast, but it's like in copper, it goes at something like 0.6 or 7 times speed of light, and speed of light at this point becomes a limiting factor. You can go maybe 3 centimeters in that amount of time. So if you get it really big, you cannot send some signal from one end of the chip to the other one and expect to get it by the time the clock edge arrives. And also, when it gets bigger, it's more costly to manufacture, both in the fact that it takes more space out of the wafer. So a wafer is, first of all, a circle, right? So you have a disk, and then these chips are squares. So if you try to fit squares on a circle, you get things that you can't use. So everything on the edge you cannot use, and if you get bigger, the proportion of the wafer that you waste goes up. And at the same time, there are always manufacturing defects during the process of manufacturing. Now, if you have smaller chips, you have one transistor that's broken. Okay, that chip is gone, but maybe that is 100th. If you produce 100 chip from one wafer, then 100, it's actually called a die at that point, right? A chip is I'm not using these things in a super strict way, so you get the idea. So these silicons, that the die may be 100th of the entire disk of the wafer. Now, if you have a bigger die, the same defect would now become, say, 1/50th of the entire wafer. So that's all. It just takes one defect. So that is the reason bigger chips are a lot more expensive, bigger dies. And also, I mean, nowadays they have these redundancies and all that stuff, so it gets slightly better, but again, the same principles still hold. Okay, so at that time, AMD and Intel were using the same processing node, which is from 250 nanometer all the way down to 1800. And then Intel introduced Pentium 4, which had a new, vastly different microarchitecture. In fact, it's a completely new family of microarchitecture. It's called NetBurst, and a lot of things is wrong with NetBurst. So that gave AMD the perfect chance to overtake Intel in terms of performance. So the thing you have to watch out for is this guy here. Pipeline stages 20. Okay, so now a pipeline, you can think about it as an assembly line, right? You got an instruction coming in here, and then each stage would work on something of that instruction. You have the fetch, decode, the traditional pipeline. We just have 5 stages, right? And these things are all super pipelines, so they each decode actually takes like 3 stages to decode or something. You got but you can think about like you have to fetch the instruction from memory. You have to decode to figure out what the hell this instruction is trying to do, and then you have load store. I forgot if a load store goes before the ALU or after, but you have some kind of a load store, and then that's basically memory access, whether you want to write to memory or read from memory for the data, right? So the first fetch is for the instruction, but they are all stored in memory. And then you have ALU, which is just actually doing the work. You got additions, multiplication, all that stuff happening there, and then you have some kind of retirement thing where you have the end of your the end of your instruction visible to the outside world. If you introduce a bigger and bigger pipeline, each stage does less work, so you can run at higher frequencies because like there's less work to do for each of these stages. But then the problem arises because when you pipeline something, you will get some penalties. First of all, if I were to fetch an instruction, I must know what the next instruction to fetch is, right? But a lot of times, if you think about computer programs, there are if statements. So what does that do to us? That means I cannot fetch the next instruction until I finish the previous one, because that previous one's instruction determines what I need to do on the next instruction. So that becomes a problem. So what we have then was what they did was called branch prediction. So basically, I guess this thing is gonna, the next instruction is gonna be stored at X. It may be stored at Y, but I'm guessing it is there. Now it sounds pretty crazy, but that's a lot of the CPU design nowadays are completely crazy. And then that's why we ended up with a meltdown and stuff. That's because of that, because of speculative execution. You had the recent Intel, the meltdown Spectra and meltdown vulnerabilities. But in any case, now you are executing some speculative instruction that you thought should be executed, but you don't really know. And then the previous instruction finishes, and they're like, "Oh, whoops! I actually should have been gone the other way." Now, if you because you have 20 stages, now you might have already executed 19 instructions, and then you suddenly found out, "Whoops! I'm executing all the wrong things." Now the cost becomes, and I have to clear out the entire pipeline, void any changes I've made, essentially, make sure the outside world never sees any of the changes that I made, and then restart from the correct thing. So now you can see that the branch prediction failure becomes a lot more costly, and that's what really drove NetBurst to become really like a really shitty microarchitecture, because even though they were running at extremely high frequencies, they weren't as good. Their IPC, in this case, think about it, IPC actually went down, quite a bit down compared to P6, which is used in Pentium 3. And that's on the AMD side. They had Hammer, which was the thing that pushed AMD to become the best time they ever had. They had cooler CPU. They introduced Opteron, which they took like 20% of server market share. Before that, they had 0. And they also introduced K10, which is mostly very similar to the K8, and they also introduced the 64-bit instruction set extension for x86, which is why when you download a bunch of things now, very often they say AMD 64. Right? So AMD 64 is basically a superset. The instruction set is a superset of x86. What we know now as x86 is really AMD 64. So that's not just it. There are a bunch of other things that Intel did during that time that was messing themselves up. So they started in 2000. So around 2000, end of Pentium 3 and beginning of Pentium 4, they started backing this company called Rambus. Somebody may still know it. They make a proprietary kind of memory. The memory is arguably better. It has higher latency, actually, higher bandwidth, but higher latency, and a lot more expensive to produce because they charge a very high licensing fee. On the other side, AMD basically went with DDR2. Actually, DDR. At that time was DDR. So went from SDRAM to DDR. DDR SDRAM. Now, DDR is an open standard, and the manufacturers don't get charged a lot of money for making these. So the manufacturers' support was much higher than Intel's side. So Intel had to backtrack. In around 2002, they had to reintroduce DDR support. So that was another blunder they had. And then Intel also did not introduce the 64-bit extension for their own instruction set. The reason was they were working with a completely new instruction set called IA64, and the only CPU that was implementing it back then was Itanium. Some of you may have heard of it, but this is a vastly different CPU. I think it's very, very wide instruction word or something. The ones that we have here, x86, are belongs to a family called complex instruction something. CSISD or something. I forgot. I actually forgot. This is pretty embarrassing. But the two things that we use now, one is that SISD, I think. The other one is ARM or MIPS, which is RISD. RISC. Sorry, CISC and RISC. I'm going crazy. CISC and RISC. Yes. But Intel was like, oh no, I'm gonna do something completely new. It's gonna be fantastic, and it would. And then they also said, okay, we'll move all the scheduling into software, so the compiler would do all the fancy things for you, but it didn't work, and I was very suspicious back then as well. Well, actually, no. I didn't even know about compilers thing back then. I only learned that in 2008 or 9 in college. But I remember distinctly thinking, why Itanium doesn't sound like a good idea, because when you are doing the scheduling in hardware, you know the runtime, you can observe it. When you compile something, you're compiling it before you're running it, right? You compile it down to CPU instructions from whatever language you're writing, C or whatever, down to CPU instructions. But that's long before you actually run the program. So you have no idea about the data that would have come into the program. So I always thought it was kind of weird that they decided to go that way. And then I actually I have a colleague. He used to work on Itanium, and yeah, he said the hardware worked beautifully, but the software didn't. The compiler basically didn't meet its expectations. All right, so Intel kept on messing up with wrong instruction set. They messed with the wrong instruction set, wrong memory technology, wrong microarchitecture. That lasted until 2006. And one thing, except the snap, you may be able to observe is that 2006 is the peak of AMD's valuation. It was crazy high. And why? Because they had the performance advantage. And what do people use to choose CPUs? Performance. I want better performance as a consumer, right? And obviously, given some reasonable power consumption and cooling and cost, but generally we look for performance. People pay like $400 for a top, not even top of the line, like mid to high level CPU, an i7, top of the line, and now will be an i9 or a Threadripper, but you might pay, that's like $1,000 plus. Very few people buy those, but people would buy $400 CPUs. Okay, so what do we learn here? AMD went essentially for standard, open standard, pretty traditional design. They didn't go all out crazy. Backward compatibility. Remember when I said AMD 64 is a superset of x86? That means anything that ran on x86 would run on AMD 64. So backward compatibility, open standard, and fairly traditional design. Intel went for proprietary standard, crazy kind of design. NetBurst was a very it's a big departure from the P6, and also it was trying to break backward compatibility with all the existing programs. So those 4 or 5 years were the best time for AMD. I remember I bought my second CPU computer was also an AMD, and I think AMD also introduced the first dual-core CPU, or it was somewhere close, but they were doing very well. And in 2006, some things happened. One, AMD bought ATI. ATI is a graphics card, a GPU designer. Secondly, Intel introduced Intel Core microarchitecture. And if you look at Core, you would see that it's actually somewhat similar to P6. In fact, it was much more similar to P6 and Pentium M. Pentium M was used exclusively in laptops. And in those days, if anyone still remembers, it's called Centrino. So what makes a Centrino is Pentium M CPU plus Wi-Fi. That's when Wi-Fi became popular. So Pentium M was basically designed for low power consumption because Pentium 4 was hot and low performance. And then one thing I had to ask myself was, why pushing Pentium 4 when you had a Pentium M, which is super attractive? But that's what they did. Anyway, so Intel Core came out, and all of a sudden, its performance was just vastly better than AMD's. But notice this took a change of the microarchitecture family, not even just a microarchitecture change. It's a completely new design to get a significant performance advantage, and that happened. And then things were just shit for AMD all the way until 2017. Right? So that was a long time to be really bad. So 13 years. Now, what happened in the middle, in the meantime, was Intel introduced TikTok, so they would keep improving their processing nodes every 2 years approximately, and then they would improve their microarchitecture every 2 years as well. Odd years they do something, even years they do something else. Right? And then AMD, because their performance is really bad, they had to sell their CPUs at a vast discount to Intel's counterparts, and eventually, and it also spent a lot of its money trying to buy bought ATI, and then they couldn't afford to keep up with Intel in terms of the fab upgrades, because every time you improve the processing nodes, you have to invest a vast amount of cash to upgrade your fabrication plants. AMD didn't have that anymore, so they had to spin off their fabrication department as Global Foundry. That's when Global Foundry came into existence. So AMD became a CPU designer without attached fabrication plants. They became very similar to Qualcomm, NVIDIA, or in some sense even Apple. So at that time, the rest of the world hasn't caught up to Intel, so AMD had to be using 28 nanometer processing nodes all the way until the beginning of 2017. And then you can see that Intel was almost 1.5 generations ahead, because for the other manufacturer, the other fabs, basically, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, TSMC, I think, is a fab. So that thing very often do half generations, right? So Intel always did 1 generation, and these guys did half generations. Global Foundry and IBM and Samsung all did half generations. So they were 1.5 generations behind Intel from 14 all the way to 17, and that was I think 16, 15 was when things were the worst for AMD. And then you notice something. Intel got stuck on 14. They're still on 14. In fact, they went from 2014 to 2018. In fact, even 19, they will be stuck on their 14 nanometer process. They got delayed so many times. The first delay came out in 2015. They said, oh, we're going to be delayed. Okay, so that delay continued until 2019, which is amazing. But they did have a 10 nanometer thing, but the yield wasn't high enough, so they kind of didn't produce it that much. Cannon Lake kind of appeared and disappeared. So this now suddenly presented a large an opportunity for AMD to play catch up. And what happened was AMD did catch up. So in 2012 or something, I forgot, they started, yeah, 2012, I think that's when they started developing the next generation of their microarchitecture family. Okay, so actually before that, let me just get into here. You got, ignore this fusion shit. It doesn't really matter that much. It just uses old CPUs and put something together. Bobcat, the CATS things, these are not high performance things. They're basically integrated. CPU is integrated graphics card used for low end stuff. These bulldozer family. So these are all one family of microarchitectures. The successor to K10, right? This stuff is really, really, really bad. It's almost as bad as NetBurst. Why is it bad? First, they went to a completely new. They broke away from the traditional designs. What they did was they put 2 cores together, and the 2 cores would, they call it I think clustered multi-thread or something. Anyway, so they put it together, but they share a lot of things. The main thing that they shared was the floating point units. So each core actually only has half of the floating point compute power of a normal core would have. They also had to share, I think they also shared fetch, instruction fetch and decode. So the cores would get starved, and then they would have bottlenecks all over the place. And the result was these things were hot as F and really slow. How slow? Their single thread performance in 2016 is about an i3, and an i3 for Intel is the lowest end of their core brand, right? And then I'm comparing that against the top of the line for AMD, which is FX 9590, I think. And keep in mind that for Intel, an i3 takes maybe 40 watts. The AMD, the 9590 for AMD takes 200 plus watts. Okay, and then if you compare the top end, an i7 would be single thread would be something like 60-70% better than a 9590, and then multi-thread was like 45% better. At the same time, the power consumption is about half or less than half. So it was a complete disaster. And what that means is all the server, well, first of all the high-end market went away because you can't compete. You're half of the performance of the other guys, right? A little bit more than half. And then you completely gave away server market that was accumulated in K8 era, because the last thing you want in a server room are CPUs that are power inefficient. Because you want to, because space in servers is a big constraint, so you want to fit as much compute in the same space as possible. But if your CPU heats up a lot, then you suddenly have cooling problems, right? So you can't fit as much compute in the same space. And then, so their server revenue went to 0. Okay, so in 2012, they started developing this new thing called Zen. The idea was that, oh, yes, sorry. Another thing I forgot to mention is for these excavator or bulldozer families, they run fairly fast in terms of frequency. They could go to 5 gigahertz, but they're very hot, and then their performance is really bad. So remember we talked about how performance is really just IPC times frequency. The frequency for these CPUs are high, and then their performance is bad. That means IPC is really bad. Which makes sense. As we talked about, they had to share some units. They had contention between the cores. It's all bad. So in 12, AMD said, okay, we're going to improve IPC on our CPUs. So they started this thing, which turned out to be Zen. The first time I paid attention to Zen was end of 2000, actually mid 2015. There was talk about how they're planning for a 40% improvement in terms of IPC compared to the bulldozers. Okay, now 40% is quite a lot. Remember the single thread performance, sorry, the multi-threaded performance for FX 9590 is only 65%. Well, i7 is only 65% faster, right, for the multi-threaded, and for single-threaded it was only 45%. So if you were able to get a 40% IPC increase without losing too much frequency, suddenly you will become competitive. And then in late 2015, AMD came out and said, oh, everything seems to be on target. We don't see any particular bottlenecks for Zen and all that stuff. I noticed that in early 2016, and then I looked at AMD's price, and I was like, okay, so this seems like a good lottery ticket to buy, because if their CPU turned out to be as good as they promised, it would be, they're suddenly back in the game. They're no longer, the seller of the low end crap. Basically, they will be able to compete on the high end as well. And what happened was they later released their CPU. It was actually 52% better in terms of IPC compared to their old generation. And now AMD CPUs are again somewhat attractive. I mean, I just bought another. I bought a server for my new venture, and being cheap, I used the consumer CPUs for the server. So I got a AMD Threadripper, able to get 32 cores, 64 threads for just $1,000 something. It's quite crazy. And oh yeah, another thing around what the computers I bought from 2008 all the way to 2017 or early 2017, every CPU that I bought was Intel, because on the AMD side there's nothing that can compare. I bought Nahilum, I bought Sandy Bridge, and I think we also have a Haswell on my wife's computer now. And in terms of laptops, well, there was no choice. AMD had, remember, they were power hungry and poorly performing. You can't put that in a laptop. Right? So all the laptops were by definition Intel, and all the desktops were Intel, even though AMD was much, much cheaper. Okay, so that kind of ends the story in terms of what happened. What's going to happen is AMD's Zen 2 is now about to be released. This stuff is on 7 nanometers. And take a look what's going on with Intel. They're still running at 14 nanometers. Okay, arguably, there's a point to be made that Intel's 10 nanometer process is actually as good as other people's 7 nanometers when everything's considered, right? So at some point these things become more like marketing, but Still, AMD, after, I don't know, forever, finally has a process advantage over Intel, and that means a lot of things in the CPU industry. So what that means is, when you imagine two guys fighting, one just have a bigger gun. You literally just have a bigger gun. You have more transistors throw around. Your transistors consume less power. Everything gets better. All right, so yeah, so that is I think it's going to do wonders for AMD. And AMD also released the EPYC line, the EPYC server line, so I think they would capture a lot of the server market. All right, so that was a long story. So what are the things to take away? Well, first, moving between microarchitecture families is a difficult thing. Intel took them 4 years to go from NetBurst to Core, and everybody knew NetBurst was crap because you can see it. It was pretty crap, right? AMD got hit in 2006 when Intel came up with a bigger gun, a better microarchitecture family, and took AMD 12 years to come up with the response. So actually 11 years only. Sorry. So the time to come up with a new family of microarchitecture is extremely long. Incremental improvements come pretty fast, so you can see for the Intel's thing. In fact, everything here, excluding this, I've never even seen this. But yeah, gold mount, I've never seen gold mount. I don't know. I've never ever even heard of it. But all these lakes, these wells and bridges and mares, they all have very similar roots tracing back to Core. And yeah, so for AMD, well, these guys were all pretty similar all the way back to here. And this one was just a shit show. A departure which didn't work. And this is the one that actually worked. Right? So it takes a long time. What that means is, if you see a company coming up with a better product, a better microarchitecture design, the advantage will last years. It's measured in at least 3+ years. And the other thing is, you have to sometimes watch the other guy's failure, right? So 2 examples, as we talked about. One is Intel going crazy in these years. From 2000 all the way to 2006, Intel was doing a bunch of stupid things. And AMD, on the other hand, did some really stupid thing in 2006. So that compounded their fall. And they bought ATI, right? And then they also had a really stupid design in the whole bulldozer stuff. But now AMD's Zen was released in 2017 officially. News about it started coming out in 2015. What does that tell us is, for Intel to come up with a vastly superior product, I'm not talking about the the stuff that used to happen, from K6 all the way to like Athlon, right? or in Intel's timeline, Pentium 2 all the way to Pentium 3, well, not all the way, but Pentium 2, Pentium 3. Not these kind of trading blows kind of improvement, but Core versus K10 and K10 versus, well, K8 versus net burst, and then that kind of improvement. So these dramatic improvement of like 40%, 50% scale, that will take them at least 3 more years for Intel to come up with that. So that is when AMD is still somewhat safe. And the last thing is processing node makes a huge difference. They were trading blows all the way to, say, 2006, and AMD had to sell its fabs, and that means they had to rely on other fabs to invest and improve to shrink their process nodes. And that means they become dependent, and then that makes competing with Intel just that much harder. Right? So Intel had the advantage of fully integrated design to manufacturing. But that is a double-edged sword. Intel is not going to use someone else to make their chips because they already have the fabs. They don't want to give up their own manufacturing capacity. And it makes sense. These are very expensive things to build. If you give them up, then suddenly you have a bunch of idle capacity, right? But this sword does cut the other way, so when your own fab gets stuck on a particular technology, then you cannot take advantage of the industry-wide advances. So you have to think about that as well. Anyways, yeah, so this is a really long history about CPUs and Intel and AMD. I had a personal fascination of these things, and also studied quite a bit on CPU design, even though I'm mostly a software guy. So yeah, so if there's something that you want to know, you can let me know, and maybe I can tell you something about it in terms of CPUs and stuff. And yeah, that's it for today. And for anyone that's stuck around so long, thank you very much. And see you next time.